Hi folks, I just want to tackle methodological naturalism and the issue of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, or the historian's task. There are historians like Bart Ehrman and Dr. Crosley who say that we should rule out any supernaturalist explanation and only go for a naturalist explanation. The idea is based on probability. There is no probability of any supernatural event, and we have to work on the best probability from a naturalistic perspective of what that event might be. Even if that is an improbable naturalistic explanation, it's better than an improbable supernaturalist explanation, or so the argument goes. The way to deconstruct this, I think, is on a few levels. Number one, there is no such thing as neutrality. Every historian will come with a specific bias. So we have to recognize that in the historical task we all have bias, and the question is, whose bias makes sense best of reality? So does the Christian perspective of bias make more sense than the secularist understanding of history and their bias? So for example, if history is a product of chance, why would a historian want to try and look in history for patterns? A Christian believes that God created this world and it was a personal creation, that it was not by chance, and that there is a reason to history. So when we look at history, we can find patterns. So two presuppositions: the secularist understanding of history. There are a variety of secular understandings of history, but we just use a general term, and a Christian perspective on history. The presuppositions of the Christian are more consistent with the secularist understanding. But even though we have our presuppositions, and our biases, we look at the consistency of those. So a Crosley and a Bart Ehrman are not being honest fully about their bias and the implications of their bias, and whether their bias are consistent or have intellectual consistency as you critique them. But then, even if we try to do as a historian, get to some kind of objective evidence, which I believe you can do, you can push your bias back and just look at the evidence, so long as you're critically aware of your bias. But your bias does give you an indication of whether your system is the right system if you do an internal critique of your bias, or I would quote presupposition. If your presuppositions are consistent, then your presuppositions are the best for the historical test. But even if you're aware of your presuppositions, you can then suppress them and try to get to some kind of more objective ground when you do so. And when you do so, methodological naturalism doesn't necessarily have to hold sway. What should be the methodology is whether the evidence indicates a certain type of an event. So the historian should not be ruling out supernatural issues, but should just be looking at the evidence. And if the evidence is explained by a supernatural phenomena, then there is no reason why that supernatural phenomena cannot be seen as the theory behind the historical event. Basically, it's about looking at the evidence. It doesn't matter, ultimately, it does matter. Your presupposition, your bias, does colour the evidence. Yeah? It does do that. But it doesn't matter in the sense that evidence speaks for itself as well. Even though we interpret that evidence, even though we manipulate that evidence with our presupposition, the evidence is still going to speak. It's kind of like a rock, a great big rock. I can have a presupposition that the rock is red, and not somebody else can have a presupposition that the rock is pink, but we both walk into the rock, we're both going to see the reality of the rock. So we can both come with our presuppositions, but it doesn't change the fact of the evidence before us, even though we might colour it as we look at it. We have to be aware that this is going on, and be critically aware and minimise, or at least accept, what our presupposition is playing on the reading of the evidence. But when we come to the evidence will speak for itself. And so you have to be willing to be open to the evidence. But if you, as a methodological naturalist, rule out any supernatural explanation, you're basically not only colouring the evidence, you're actually pushing evidence out of the on the reflection of that historical issue. So I'll give you an example. David Hume wanted to investigate historically whether there were miracles in the time of Pascal, and he had a criteria for investigating it. He went to investigate with a number of criteria, historical criteria, about these miracles, and came to the conclusion on the basis of his criteria that the miracles actually took place. But then he said, using methodological naturalism, they couldn't have taken place because miracles just don't happen. But because before that he went looking just at the evidence with an open mind, the evidence actually was saying to him miracles actually took place. But it was his presupposition of methodological naturalism that made him push that evidence away and say it couldn't have happened. So whichever way you look at it, whichever presupposition you come to, when you come to the evidence of the resurrection, you have to ask this question: what is the evidence saying? And if the evidence points to a supernaturalist explanation, you can't rule it out with your methodological naturalism, because that is what the evidence is saying. Do you get it? I'll link to the to an article that will fill you in a bit more, and God bless you, and think about this in more detail. God bless.